In the quiet town where the prison stood, life outside seemed peaceful, almost serene. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The high-security facility, surrounded by a thick perimeter fence and patrolled by armed guards, was a place where every action was monitored, and every corner seemed to whisper secrets. Correctional officers carried out their duties with a practiced routine, and the inmates, though under constant surveillance, still found ways to scheme, whispering in the shadows and watching the guards closely. Among the officers was Lisa Carter, a woman who had earned a reputation for her professionalism and no-nonsense attitude. She had worked in the prison for over 5 years, climbing the ranks through sheer dedication. While the other officers seemed to become jaded over time, Lisa remained disciplined, holding firm to her belief in the system and her responsibility to maintain order. She was admired by some, feared by others, and always kept a distance from the inmates. No one, however, knew that behind her tough exterior, Lisa was hiding something dangerous, something that could destroy everything she had worked for. It all started with Richard Hayes, an inmate who had been in the prison for nearly 3 years. He was known for his involvement in a violent robbery spree that left multiple people injured. His reputation as a cold, calculating criminal made him one of the most notorious figures in the prison. But there was something about him that intrigued Lisa. It wasn't just his reputation or his intelligence. It was the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to see through her tough exterior and into the depths of her soul. At first, their interactions were minimal, just brief exchanges during her rounds as she checked on his cell. Richard had a charm that was hard to ignore. His voice was smooth and his smile, though rare, had a warmth that made Lisa feel like she wasn't just another officer to him. Over time, their conversations grew longer. Lisa would stop by his cell during her shifts, speaking to him about mundane topics, at first books, weather, anything to avoid suspicion. But the connection between them grew stronger. Richard seemed to understand her in ways no one else did. He saw through her professional mask and made her feel alive in a way that she hadn't felt in years. Lisa found herself drawn to him. There was a raw honesty in Richard's eyes, a vulnerability that few others ever saw. He shared stories of his past, of the mistakes that led him to prison, and of his regrets. He wasn't the typical hardened criminal that she had grown accustomed to dealing with. He had layers, complexities that Lisa couldn't ignore. Slowly, over time, their conversations turned into something more intimate. A glance here, a subtle touch there, and soon, Lisa found herself falling for the very man she was supposed to be guarding. It was dangerous. Lisa knew it. An officer involved with an inmate was a scandal waiting to happen, and if anyone found out about their growing bond, it would cost her everything: her career, her freedom, and her reputation. She should have stopped it, should have reported Richard to her superiors for crossing the line. But she couldn't. She was too far in, and the idea of losing him, of exposing the fragile connection they had built, was too much to bear. So Lisa kept their secret hidden. Their meetings became more frequent, their exchanges more meaningful. Lisa would sometimes sneak Richard extra privileges during her shifts, turning a blind eye when he broke small rules. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but at the time neither of them could see the inevitable consequences of their actions. Lisa's world was shifting, spinning into something she could no longer control. And in the quiet moments between the cells, between the walls of the prison, a forbidden relationship was blooming, one that would change everything. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between Lisa and Richard deepened, but so did the tension. Lisa's once clear sense of duty began to blur, replaced by the constant fear of discovery. Every stolen glance, every brief exchange, began to feel like a dangerous risk. She knew the stakes. If anyone found out about the affair, it wouldn't just ruin her career, it could lead to criminal charges. Lisa had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now she was living in a world of secrecy, where every decision she made seemed to be governed by fear. Richard, too, was growing more restless. While Lisa hid her feelings beneath a hardened exterior, he had no such reservations. He was bolder, more open with his affection, and he made no effort to hide the bond that was clearly forming between them. Richard had started to drop hints, suggesting that one day they could be together outside the prison walls, that they could escape the lives they were trapped in. He talked of freedom with an intensity that both excited and terrified Lisa. His words were seductive, yet they carried an underlying warning. He was pushing for something more, something permanent, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of the situation. One evening, Richard made it clear that he had no intention of staying confined behind bars forever. He had found a way to escape. Over the months, he had befriended a few of the inmates who worked in maintenance, slowly building a network of people who could help him break out. Lisa hadn't been entirely unaware of his plan. She had heard rumors, whispers in the prison about Richard's growing circle of trusted allies, but hearing it from him directly made her blood run cold. He had managed to obtain a key to the prison gate, a small but vital piece in his plan to break free. Lisa's heart raced as Richard outlined the escape plan, detailing the timing, the route, and the roles the other inmates would play in the scheme. It was almost too perfect, too calculated. For a moment, Lisa felt a surge of excitement, the idea of running away with Richard, starting fresh somewhere far from the watchful eyes of the prison system. But then the weight of the reality hit her. This escape, if it succeeded, would ruin everything. It wasn't just about the escape, it was about everything they had done to cover their tracks, everything they had hidden from the authorities. If Richard broke free, there was a very real possibility that their secret affair would be exposed. The evidence, the emails, the stolen moments, it would all come to light. Lisa felt cornered, suffocated by her own choices. The idea of losing Richard was unbearable, but the idea of losing everything she had worked for was even worse. She couldn't imagine being locked away in a prison cell herself, not for a man who was already behind bars. Yet the thought of betraying him, of turning him in, was even more unthinkable. Richard had come to mean something more to her than just a secret lover. He had become a symbol of escape, a way out of the rigid life she had built for herself. As the days passed, Lisa grew more paranoid. Every time she saw Richard, she was reminded of the ticking clock, the inevitable moment when everything would either implode or disappear. She began to notice things she hadn't before, small details in the way Richard moved, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long. He was growing more impatient, more certain that the escape was the only way forward. Lisa's mind raced, torn between loyalty to the man she loved and her fear of the consequences that would follow if the truth came to light. The pressure mounted with every passing day. Lisa's once clear path was now clouded with doubt, and every decision seemed to carry an unbearable weight. Richard's escape plan was no longer just a whisper of possibility. It was a reality that was closing in on her, threatening to unravel everything. Lisa realized that the affair she had tried so desperately to keep hidden was no longer just a secret. It was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The night of the planned escape arrived, and with it, the heavy weight of impending consequences. Lisa stood at the prison gates, her eyes scanning the facility as she walked her usual rounds, but her mind was elsewhere. Everything felt off. The usually steady rhythm of her duties had turned into a chaotic blur of conflicting emotions. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of a precipice, and with every step she took, she was getting closer to the point of no return. Richard had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the escape. He seemed more agitated, more desperate, and Lisa couldn't ignore the warning signs. He had become more insistent, talking less about their future together and more about his escape plan. It was clear that he was determined to go through with it, and nothing was going to stop him. Lisa had tried to reason with him, but deep down, she knew that he was beyond convincing. His mind was made up, and she was powerless to change it. As the night wore on, Lisa's anxiety grew. She knew that the escape had been carefully planned. Richard had everything in place, from the key to the guard schedules, but she couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong. The prison was notorious for its tight security, and no one had ever successfully escaped. Even though Richard had managed to find a way out, Lisa knew that there was always the possibility that they would both get caught. She received a message from Richard, a a subtle indication that the moment had arrived. Her heart raced. She was positioned close enough to where Richard was supposed to be, and the timing of his message suggested that he was about to make his move. Lisa was torn between staying in her position, where she could keep an eye on things, and following Richard. But the pull of duty stopped her. She couldn't abandon her post, not when the security of the entire facility was on the line. And yet, the need to protect Richard, her secret lover, was overpowering. She decided to leave her post and discreetly make her way toward Richard's cell. She knew she had to act quickly. The more time she spent thinking, the more time she gave for things to go wrong. The air felt thick with tension as she approached the hallway leading to his cell, and she could feel her pulse racing in her ears. Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified in the silence. When Lisa reached Richard's cell, she saw the chaos that was unfolding. The plan had gone awry. Richard had been caught, not by the guards but by other inmates who had noticed him slipping away. He had been cornered, and the sounds of muffled voices and scuffling echoed in the hallway. Lisa's heart sank. She had no idea what had gone wrong, but it was clear that Richard was in danger of being exposed. If anyone caught wind of what had been happening between them, their entire lives would be destroyed. In that instant, everything became a blur. Panic overtook her senses. Lisa rushed toward Richard, hoping to stop the commotion and get him out of the situation. But as she reached his side, something snapped inside her, a feeling of desperation she couldn't control. She had to stop Richard from speaking, from revealing the truth that could ruin them both. In a moment of utter panic, Lisa acted without thinking. She moved quickly, grabbing Richard and strangling him in a sudden burst of fear-driven violence. His struggles were brief, and then he fell limp in her arms. The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa stood frozen, her hands still wrapped around Richard's neck, as if she couldn't process what had just happened. The reality of her actions hit her like a wave. She had just killed the man she had once loved, the man she had been trying to protect. There was no turning back now. The affair was no longer just a secret, it was a murder, and Lisa knew that her life would never be the same. As the shock began to settle in, Lisa realized the gravity of what she had done. The escape plan had failed, but in her attempt to cover it up, she had sealed her fate. The weight of Richard's body in her arms was the final, undeniable evidence of her desperation and fear. There would be no escaping the consequences now. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she stood over Richard's lifeless form, knowing that the truth would eventually come out, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. The morning after Richard's death, the prison seemed eerily quiet, like a storm had passed, leaving nothing but stillness in its wake. Lisa had barely slept, her mind running on a loop of the events that had unfolded. She had killed Richard, and now she was trapped in her own web of lies. She tried to convince herself that it had been self-defense, that she had acted in the heat of the moment to protect herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. The escape had failed, and in her panic, she had murdered the one man who had made her feel alive. Lisa tried to keep her composure as the investigation began. The prison staff was shaken by the discovery of Richard's body, and the authorities were immediately notified. Everyone, from the warden to the guards, seemed to be in shock, struggling to make sense of the situation. The fact that an inmate had been killed within the walls of the prison was already troubling enough, but the circumstances surrounding it raised more questions. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence that Richard had been involved in anything violent leading up to his death. It didn't make sense. Lisa, however, quickly found herself slipping into the role of the witness, the officer who had been present when the incident occurred. She calmly explained that she had found Richard in the midst of trying to escape, and that she had acted out of instinct when she saw him threatening other inmates. The guards who had been present during the altercation, though, were quick to back her story. They had seen Richard attempt to flee, and they agreed that Lisa had done what she needed to do to subdue him. It was a story that everyone seemed willing to accept, and for a moment, Lisa allowed herself to believe it too. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would stay hidden. But Detective Mark Roberts, a seasoned investigator brought in to examine the case, was not so easily convinced. He had been on the force long enough to spot a lie when he saw one. There was something about the way Lisa spoke, the way she described the events, that didn't sit right with him. His instincts told him that there was more to the story, and he began to dig deeper. He interviewed the other officers, combed through security footage, and reviewed the reports of the night in question. It didn't take long for him to uncover the first crack in Lisa's story. The timeline of events didn't align. According to the footage, Lisa had been far from Richard's cell when the alarm had gone off. How had she gotten there so quickly, and why had she intervened so aggressively? Roberts found the absence of a struggle particularly suspicious. Richard had been a violent inmate, a man capable of fighting his way out of almost any situation. Yet there were no signs of physical altercation in his cell. It didn't add up. The more Roberts dug, the more inconsistencies he uncovered. The most telling of all was Lisa's relationship with Richard. Through interviews with the other officers, he learned that Lisa had spent a significant amount of time with him, far more than was appropriate for an officer of the law. There had been whispers, rumors about their closeness, but nothing concrete. Until now. The more he pieced together, the clearer it became that Lisa and Richard had been involved in something far more dangerous than a mere escape plan. Their relationship had been secret, illicit, and fraught with risk. But it wasn't just their affair that Roberts was concerned with, it was the murder. The investigation began to zero in on Lisa, and the pressure mounted. She continued to maintain her story, but Roberts wasn't backing down. He brought in her colleagues, those who had worked with her for years, and each of them shared their own suspicions. Lisa had been too calm, too composed in the face of tragedy. Her actions hadn't been those of someone reacting to a dangerous situation, they had been the actions of someone with something to hide. Soon, Roberts uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. Lisa's behavior in the days leading up to Richard's death was telling. She had been acting strange, avoiding certain areas of the prison and keeping her distance from other officers. But what truly raised suspicion was the fact that she had been the one to alert the prison authorities about Richard's planned escape, even though she had not been directly involved in his cell that night. The more Roberts learned, the more the pieces fell into place. Lisa's involvement was not just a case of an officer doing her duty, it was a calculated, deliberate cover-up. As the investigation continued to unfold, Lisa's world began to crumble around her. The truth, it seemed, was slipping through her fingers, and no amount of lies or half-truths could keep it at bay. The walls that she had spent so many years building to protect her secret were closing in, and there was nowhere left to hide. Detective Roberts knew that he was getting closer to the truth, and soon, Lisa would have to face the consequences of her actions. The walls of the prison felt like they were closing in on Lisa, suffocating her with every passing day. The weight of the investigation pressed heavily on her shoulders, and she could feel the eyes of her fellow officers on her, their suspicion palpable. Each glance, each whispered conversation behind her back reminded her that the truth was beginning to surface. Lisa's world, once so carefully constructed, was unraveling at a terrifying speed. There was no denying it now. Detective Roberts was getting closer, and every step she took seemed to bring her nearer to the inevitable. Lisa had spent years building a reputation, earning the trust of her colleagues, and maintaining a semblance of control over the chaotic world of the prison. Now, all of it seemed to be crumbling piece by piece. She had always been in control, but now she was losing her grip on everything that mattered. Richard's death had been a tragic accident, a moment of panic that had spiraled out of control. At least, that's what she tried to tell herself. But the truth was she had killed him. In a moment of blind fear and desperation, she had silenced him forever. The investigation was tightening around her, and Lisa knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Detective Roberts wasn't letting up. His questions were relentless, his pursuit of the facts methodical. He had uncovered enough inconsistencies in her story to cast serious doubt on her account of the events. The timeline didn't match up, and her behavior, in the days before Richard's death, was now under a magnifying glass. But it wasn't just the facts that were working against her, it was the mounting evidence of her involvement with Richard. The affair, once so carefully hidden, had become the cornerstone of the investigation, and Lisa's past was now an open book, filled with damning details. Lisa had always believed she could protect herself, that her secrets would remain buried, safe from the prying eyes of the law. But now it seemed like everything she had done had led her to this moment. She was trapped, caught in the lie she had built. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had made a terrible mistake. The affair had never been worth the risk. Richard had been a dangerous, unpredictable man, but in the end it was Lisa who had paid the price for her actions. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, a way to salvage what little was left of her career and her freedom. But there was no escape. The evidence was too overwhelming. Detective Roberts had already spoken to the other officers who had worked with her, and their testimonies painted a damning picture. Her colleagues spoke of her growing distance from the rest of the staff, her sudden withdrawal from her usual duties, and her inexplicable behavior in the days leading up to Richard's death. The whispers were growing louder, and Lisa could no longer ignore them. As the investigation continued, Lisa's nerves began to fray. She found herself alone more often, isolated in her thoughts, consumed by guilt and fear. She couldn't help but replay the events in her mind, each moment a painful reminder of the choice she had made. She had killed Richard to protect herself, to cover up the truth. But now the truth was coming for her, and there was no hiding from it. The day of the final interrogation arrived, and Lisa knew it was over. Detective Roberts was unrelenting, his questions sharp and direct. He had already pieced together the fragments of her story, and now all that was left was for Lisa to face the consequences. She sat in the sterile room, the weight of her actions pressing down on her, knowing that there was no escaping the truth. When Detective Roberts finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. He laid out the evidence, the inconsistencies in her story, and the timeline that didn't match up. Lisa could feel the walls closing in on her, the realization that everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. There was no way to explain away the truth. The affair, the escape, the murder, everything was laid bare in front of her. In the end, Lisa couldn't deny it. She had killed Richard, and she had done it to protect her secret. The guilt, the shame, and the fear were overwhelming, but there was nothing left to do but accept the consequences of her actions. Lisa knew that her life would never be the same again. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the price of her choices was one she would have to pay for the rest of her life. As she was led out of the interrogation room, the reality of her situation hit her with full force. The prison she had once ruled had become her own personal cage, and now there was no escape. The truth had caught up with her, and the life she had built was shattered beyond repair.